We have talked about the basics of live looping into the session view of Ableton. Before moving on with advanced techniques and practical examples, I'd like to spend some words about instruments and arrangement in the sense of the list of sounds you are going to use in order to play your songs. I'm not telling you to use guitar, bass, synths, a specific sound, etc., because you have your own setup and your own needs. For example, and this is the basics, you may have a lot of physical instruments to use which need to be plugged into the audio device or the audio interface, or you may have a lot of virtual instruments to be used so that they are all MIDI controlled. Regardless of that, you have to remember that the instruments you use are your palette, the colors you're using for painting your songs. And you have two needs to cover. First of all, you must be flexible with your instruments because every sound, every kind of instrument covers a certain role inside your song. And the second need is that you must be quick moving from an instrument to the other. This is valid both for virtual instruments and for physical instruments. Talking about physical instruments, it's easy to lose a lot of time, for example, taking on the guitar or the bass or putting them down before moving to another instrument. So that if you have a lot of physical instruments, you must find the way to set them up in order to move from one to the other the most flexible and the quickest possible. This may be the case of setting up multiple audio inputs, multiple microphones, but you have to remember that there is a limit to the sources you can access rapidly inside the session view. You may have 2,000 tracks with 2,000 microphone inputs or 2,000 virtual instruments, but every time you have to access one, you have to scroll down, and you can see that from my view. You have to scroll down, going, selecting them with a mouse, and this is not practical. It's just like having to put down your bass and go on the other side of the room and take another instrument. You have to find the most flexible way, and you have to cover a range of needs inside your song. So, let's talk about a theory. If you use a surface controller for Ableton, just like the APC Key 25 or any other controller, the maximum range it covers at the same time is a grid of 8 per 8. This means that you can move this grid around. If you see on the screen, you can notice a red box moving through the screen to the session view. This box highlights the channels, the tracks, and the clips I can act onto, which means that these buttons here now covers the first 8 tracks of my setup. I can move these along in order to select the other ones, but this can be confusing because as long as my grid is fixed at the starting position, I know that track 1 is a certain instrument, track 2 is another one, and I can move through them by activating them with just a button press. The same thing may happen if you decide to control the channels with your physical keyboard. Do you remember, if you press key in the right top corner, you can assign each of the arm button to a specific number. For example, these buttons here are mapped to number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, which means that, moving out, if I press number 1, I'm going to activate this channel, 2, the channel 10, 3, 11, 4, 12, and etc., etc. You can do the same for the first channel. You can map as ever you want. But when you arrive at number 9, you cannot use number 0, or you cannot use any other number to map them. So it becomes difficult to remember what is there and what activates what. My suggestion for every kind of looper is to keep things at minimal. If you have few instruments to manage, if you have just a little number of channels to control, you have much better control on what colors, what palette are you using, what you have to activate, deactivate, move. It's much easier to manage. If you have an infinite number of instruments, first of all, you lose track of the instruments you are using. Second one, you spend a lot of time looking through the list of virtual instruments to activate, or you lose time moving from one instrument to another in the real world. So keep things simple. My advice is to start with 8 tracks, no more. They can be all virtual instruments. They can be a mix of virtual instruments and microphone inputs, but the number I suggest is 8, no more. Once you're familiar with 8 tracks, you may decide to go beyond 8 and map some of the other tracks to the keyboard. But my advice is to stick to 8 tracks because it's easier to manage and they are exactly the 8 tracks you will control with a Surface controller. Now, the point is what kind of instruments I will need for my song. I'm not talking about a specific genre because every genre has his palette of sounds. If you play folk, you may need guitars, easy percussions, old style percussions, and your voice maybe because you're singing. If you play, for example, synthwave, you may need an electric drum, a synth bass, pads, synths, and maybe your voice if you're singing. If you play funk, you may decide to use drums, a bass, which may be a physical bass or an emulation, a Wurley or a Rhodes piano, and horn sections. So I'm not talking about genre. I'm talking about roles. Every instrument class has a role inside your song, regardless of the genre. And it's important to remember which kind of instruments cover which role so that you can easily fill up the 8 tracks with exactly the instruments you need. No more and no less.